Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to look out to take some piano loops. Either you can make them yourself or just use a sample that you've downloaded and turn them into some really cool lo-fi hip-hop loops. This is all going to be using stock Ableton Live plugins, and the main thing by the end of this is focusing on how to use the simpler to make some really cool resampled piano loops. So let's get into it. So the first thing that I've got here is a piano loop that I've made myself. Now, you don't have to have your own piano loop. You can download a sample from Splice or wherever you get your samples from. But if you do make your own, the main thing that you're focusing on is having a big chord at the beginning and not to be too complex in terms of how many notes are playing over the space of a bar. Because when it comes to the resampling aspect of this, you want to be able to cut this up in a way where you've got enough elements to use by themselves. So for example, having this chord at the beginning of the bar, that amount of time when I start to resample this is going to allow me to play that back. If I had lots of notes playing above this, like this section here, but all over the place, if we copied that, it's going to start to become an issue and I'm not going to have enough to work with. It's not that you should make it super simple and just have the chords by themselves, but if you want a little bit of fills at the end of each bar, don't make them overly complex. That's the main rule of thumb to work with this. So now that I've got this, and if you're wondering how I've made this piano sound, it's just the Freelab software, the soft piano, and I've used my own processing on this, OTT, glue compressor, EQ8, I'm using RC20 for some distortion, wobble and reverb, and another glue compressor just to stop it from clipping. So nothing massively complex in the processing of this. You can grab any piano that you want, any free piano or paid piano that you got, whether it's Contact, Mini Grand, anything like that. The main thing is that you're working with a piano. So the next thing that we're going to do is I've resampled this down to another channel. If you're wondering how to resample, create an audio channel below the one that you're working with, go into external in and set it to resampling, record arm, solo the channel that you're recording from. And as you can see, it's recording and resampling that piano loop. And if I just play this back, it's the same sample but now in audio format instead of MIDI format. Another way that you could do that is just copy the MIDI channel and then freeze and flatten. But there's two different ways you can resample or freeze and flatten, depending on how you like to work. So now that we've got this audio loop of the MIDI piano, obviously if you just downloaded a sample itself from Splice or wherever, you would have missed that first step. You wouldn't have had to go through it. But let's get into the next sort of stage of the resampling. So I'm just going to turn everything, all of the effects off so we can start from the basics of how I've got to the sound that I've got to. If we listen back to this audio loop, the first thing that I've applied here is basically a mid-band EQ, high-pass filter around 100 Hz, low-pass filter around 1.67 kHz, and a little bit of a notch around 1.29 kHz. I just noticed with this specific piano sound, it worked best to have that little notch there. And this is what this sounds like. As you can hear, it's already bringing us into the lo-fi territory. Next thing that I've applied after that is a vocoder. I've used noise as a carrier and enhanced the noise. Set the dry wet to 36%, bandwidth to 27.8%. Set the bands to 40 in the range from 574 Hz to 20 kHz. This really just mess around with yourself until you get a sound that you like. This just helps shape the sound a little bit more. When applying any effects like this from EQ to vocoder, don't just copy the settings that I've used. Play around with the settings for yourself to find out what works specifically for what you're making. This isn't just a copy and paste tutorial, it's just to show you the sort of basic techniques of how to get to the sound that we're going to get to at the end of this. After this, I've added a little bit of erosion in the white noise setting, width at 2.26 and amount at 0.27. This is a very small amount of noise, and again, it's just to add that sort of lo-fi grit. It's very, very subtle, this, if I wanted to increase it. Again, apply that to taste. I've added another vocoder after this. This time I've used the modulator as the carrier and enhanced that. Set the bands to 40. You can see the settings here. The main thing is I've changed the formants to -12. Again, dry wet to 28%, depth to 127%, and the release to 514 milliseconds. And this is what that sounds like. The main thing obviously here is that the format at -12 semitones has really added some extra low-end warble to the sound, again accentuating that lo-fi sound that I'm trying to achieve. After this, I've added a multiband dynamics OTT setting, just expanded, well, really expanded the lows and a little bit in the mid and the highs as well. Set the time to 223% and brought the amount down to 48%. This really is just there to glue everything that's happened previously together. After this, we've got a glue compressor bringing the threshold down to -15.6 decibels and the makeup gain to 7.46 decibels. Again, this is a little bit more of a gluing compressor just to glue everything together. And also to bring a little bit of loudness back to the sound with the makeup gain because it started to get a little bit too quiet. After this, I've got a hybrid reverb. You can apply any reverb sound that you want to this. I've specifically gone for a hybrid reverb. I'm going between the convolution and the shimmer algorithm, the blend of 85 to 15, so 15% of it's the shimmer algorithm. I've kept the pitch at 0 semitones. This is a really cool algorithm if you're using Ableton Live and you've got hybrid reverb. The shimmer algorithm gets some really interesting sounds. Set the dry wet to 50%. Main thing that I have done in the EQ here is took out all of the top end because I don't want this to be a super bright sound. Again, we're talking about lo-fi here. It should have this degradation quality to it. And this is what that reverb sounds like. It's quite subtle, but it just fills in a little bit of the gaps of the sound. This is there to sort of bolster the sound rather than to completely colour the sound. After this, I've added another OTT, just expanding all of the bands in a small way, really bringing down the mid band, setting the time to 223% and the amount to 22%. I found this just brought a little bit of the top end grit out and controlled the mids a little bit better as well. After this, another EQ8, I started to find it was getting a little bit too strong in the low mids, and I wanted to also bring up the high mids a little bit more as well. This is mainly just a balancing EQ, just to sort of shape things back together so they're not too strong in the low end or too weak in the high end either. And at the end of that, a glue compressor just to catch any peaks and bring the level a little bit more close together so it's not jumping all over the place in loudness differences. This isn't to completely remove the dynamics, but it's not leave it too dynamically expressive. In a sense, the name sort of says it, just to glue things together in a loudness way. So once all that was done, I copied and pasted the channel, which we'll do that now just to sort of show how it's done. On that channel, I've right-clicked and freeze and flattened, and that's how I've got to this final audio below it. Now, what will happen when you do freeze and flatten, you'll end up with a little bit of a tail end of the audio. I would recommend you delete that and then consolidate this audio down so it just becomes a 4-bar loop. This makes the resampling in the simpler a lot easier to do rather than having that extra tail end and it adding extra steps of what you're going to play back. It just makes things easier and more concise in a way to work with. So as you can see, we've got the same audio. This is the audio with the processing after the fact. If I turned it all off, I'd get back to the original piano, which actually I can demonstrate that now. And then just obviously having this audio channel with all of it baked in is going to allow me to start using this in the simpler. So I would always recommend keeping the original versions that you've got just in case you want to go back and edit anything and you find that it's not working to your liking. So the next step after this is I've loaded up a MIDI channel and I've put a sampler on it. I've set it to slice mode and I've dragged and dropped the final resampled version of the lo-fi piano with all of the baked in effects. Now as you can see, when we load this into the sampler, we get a lot of these markers to start with. And if we play this back on the piano, as you can see the start point for this sample, we've got a little bit of a point that's not really playing anything. I have to start from C sharp to get anywhere with the sample. So what I'm going to do, and this is the bit where this just takes time, and I would recommend you take the time to do it, is go through and with a MIDI keyboard, if you don't have that, you can use your QWERTY keyboard. If you turn the keys part on, your QWERTY keyboard is an actual keyboard. What we're going to do now is just going to go through and make sure that each aspect that we're playing or slice of this is going to be long enough to be usable. Now, little steps like that I would recommend just keep as one note instead of cutting it up into two. Like that we didn't need. That tail end, now it could be useful that you would want that marker in as the tail end, but for this purpose it's not really necessary. And then the final one, this sort of fill on the end, I just want to keep that as one note. And what I've done is I've drawn a load of MIDI notes in here, and let's see how that sounds when we play it back. As you can see from the MIDI notes, it's playing back the slices in a different order to what the original piano loop was. And this is where you can really start to get into that cool resampled lo-fi hip-hop territory. At the moment this is playing back quite quietly, but I'm going to start to add some extra effects on top of this to really accentuate that lo-fi resampled hip-hop territory. First thing that I want to do with this though is I'm going to group this sampler and I'm going to make another version of it. So we're just duplicating that chain, and now I've got two of them. And what I'm going to do in the second chain is I'm going to transpose this one 12 semitones up. So we basically got the same sample, but the second one is an octave above the first one. And let's hear what that sounds like together. Now, the issue we have at the moment is the octave above is playing twice as fast, and that's why it's ending so quickly. So what I would recommend is you turn warp on and go through the different algorithms to find the one that you like the most. Let's stick with beats for now, see how that sounds. Now that's adding some interesting artifacts, but I think the artifacts are a little bit too strong, so we're going to move to Complex Pro. Let's bring the formats down a little bit. I find having the formats around 20 to 50 is a good starting point. What I seem to find is that keeps a lot of the integrity of the original sample. This is a very usable one, especially with vocals as well, if you're pitching them up and down. But having this extra octave layer is really, really cool because it just adds an extra element to the sound that you wouldn't get from just playing it in MIDI by itself. Now we could go to the fifth instead, and if we change the transpose to 7 semitones. Be careful with that one, because when you move into the fifth, especially if you're playing really colourful chords, you might get into the territory where you get some weird, strange harmonics, but it might be the sound that you're going for. So again, have a play around with that. Octave and the fifth, which is 7 semitones, are usually the best to go for, but depending on how complex the harmonics are that you're playing with, then you've got to be careful with the fifth. But for this purpose, we're just going to stick with the root and the octave. So after this, I'm just going to bring in another OTT, the multiband dynamics, but with the OTT setting. I'm going to bring in EQ after that for some shaping, and a glue compressor after that with soft clip turned on, just to stop anything from clipping and getting too loud. First thing that I'm going to do with the OTT is I'm going to bring out the mids, but just expanding this band. I'm just dragging upwards and the highs as well. Let's see what that sounds like straight away. So there's a little bit too much going on in the lows. I could actually just turn this band off. Yeah, I think that works a little bit better. I'm just going to increase the time amount. And what this is doing is increasing all of these values. So when it's originally set to 100%, these are all just the values that they're set at. When we set that to 200%, it increases these to 200% of the original value. So 132 milliseconds becomes 264 milliseconds. And the same with all of the other values, they just double, or to a percentage that you've set it to. Just going to bring the amount down, so we've got a mixture between the wet and the dry. I'm just finding it's getting a little bit too crisp in the top end when it's set to 100%. After this, we're just going to do some EQ shaping. And then after that, maybe a little bit of extra compression. And that in a nutshell really is how to create a really cool lo-fi hip-hop piano loop resampled using Simpler. And two versions of it, the original octave and the 12 semitones above. So let's listen back to that again. So something that I've done as well is I've made a lot of different styles of these. So let's play back a few that I've made. And this is currently a sample pack that I'm working on at the moment. Another lo-fi chill hip-hop kind of sound, but more leaning into this sort of resample territory, using piano and different loops like that. Anyway, I hope you found this video really useful. Any questions that you've got or any topics that you'd like me to cover in future videos, let me know in the comments. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, God bless and goodbye.